Starting with UFC 319, where Carlos Prates and Lerone Murphy got back-to-back KOs with the technique on the same card. The spinning back elbow has become an increasingly common technique at the highest levels of mixed martial arts. In the main event of Noche UFC, Diego Lopez used a spinning elbow to KO the hyped-up fighting nerd and Benjamin Netanyahu fan John Silva, who was previously undefeated in the UFC and seen by many as a future champion. And although I'm sure most of you only watched it as a highlight that popped up on your Instagram Reels or Twitter timeline, Sergio Pettis flatlined the Dagestani fighter Magomed Magomedov with a spinning elbow in PFL right in front of Khabib. Now, you typically wouldn't think that a flashy technique like the spinning back elbow would work at the highest level of the sport. It's an attack that needs a lot of wind-up, it has a pretty short range, it opens you up to having your back taken, and requires you to take your eyes off your opponent, making it difficult to aim. But spinning elbows are working, and they are being used to beat incredibly talented fighters in devastating fashion. So, why is that? Why are spinning elbows taking over MMA? Well, in this video, I'll be examining and explaining why spinning back elbows are taking over mixed martial arts, and also bring up a real simple method that fighters can use to counter this attack. So yes, let's get right into the analysis. First, let's talk about elbows in MMA in general. Now, I'm personally of the opinion that fighters should be throwing way more elbows in their fights than they already do, since many fighters tend to stick to throwing punches, even when they are in the pocket, in the clinch, or on the ground. And that's because, with the exception of their range, elbows are superior to punches in virtually every way. Let's get started with the power. Now, if you've ever trained in a striking art, you would know how difficult it can be to get a lot of power behind your punches. Mastering proper punching form can take years of work, and even then, you could just naturally be kind of pillow-fisted. In contrast, getting a ton of power behind an elbow is much more simple. Due to there being one less point in the kinetic chain, it's much easier to get a good wallop behind an elbow. Also, due to the smaller surface area of an elbow compared to the human fist, all of the force generated is concentrated in a smaller space, leading to a greater impact when connecting with a target. This is why you see fighters who are typically seen as pillow-fisted, like Lerone Murphy and Sergio Pettis, completely flatlining their opponents with their elbow KOs. And when a more powerful fighter like Diego Lopez and Yuri Prochazka land their elbows, the effect is even more devastating. John Silva hadn't even been dropped in the UFC prior to getting hit with Lopez's elbow, let alone KO'd. And when Yuri slept Dominic Reyes, Reyes suffered bilateral nasal bone fractures, a right displaced orbital medial wall fracture, and a left displaced orbital zygomatic arch fracture. In other words, he was really fucked up. In addition to the power of elbows, the other big advantage is that your elbow is a much more durable part of your body than your fist. The human hand contains 27 bones, most of which are small and quite delicate. This is why many combat sports athletes break their hands when fighting, which is doubly true for MMA fighters who fight in 4-ounce gloves that have much less padding. In contrast, the human elbow joint is composed of 3 bones, all of which are much larger and much more durable. Although breaking your hand in MMA isn't as big of a hindrance as it would be in boxing, where you're limited to punching, it compromises other aspects of your game, mainly your ability to grapple effectively. And then, the final big advantage I want to talk about is the facial damage that elbows can cause. In addition to the elbow point concentrating all of the power generated from a fighter's kinetic chain, the elbow joint is the #1 way to cut your opponent open in MMA. I discussed this before in my video on which physical attributes are the best for MMA, but having sharp joints can let you split your opponent open even when you don't land clean with a strike. Some great examples of this happening with elbows include John Silva's fight against Drew Dober, where he caused a doctor stoppage against Drew Dober by using spinning elbows to open up a gash above Dober's eyes, and in Diego Lopez's win over John Silva, where John Silva was turned into a bloody mess as was promised to him 3,000 years ago. When you're throwing punches to the face, you typically want to hit your opponent on the chin, on the temple, or behind the ear. Landing a punch on your opponent's forehead can score you points by snapping their head back, but you can also very easily break your hand because of how dense that bone is. And it's also virtually impossible to knock out your opponent with a shot to the forehead. Unless you're fighting Johnny Walker, of course, but that's just an exception that proves the rule. However, with elbows, a fighter can slice their opponent open, which not only provides a great visual for the judges that can lead to the round being scored favorably, but can compromise an opponent's vision due to blood flowing into their eyes and even lead to a doctor's stoppage TKO. But anyways, with all those advantages of elbows and MMA in general wrapped up, let's talk about why spinning back elbows in particular are so effective nowadays. Now, the number one advantage of the spinning back elbow is that it is a very unusual strike. Not only does the elbow come at an awkward angle, the technique is also something that many fighters don't have a defensive response programmed for. In many MMA gyms, throwing any elbows, let alone spinning elbows, during sparring is prohibited. This is precisely because of the upsides I described in the previous section of this video. It's very easy to get a lot of power behind them, and you can end up cutting your sparring partner open. Also, during my time making my videos on MMA gyms, I've watched a ton of sparring footage from various gyms, and it's surprising how rarely I see elbow pads being worn, which just further tells me that elbows are a no-no in sparring at most gyms. However, not having elbows thrown in sparring leads to fighters not being prepared for them when they are actually thrown in a fight. And well, as is often said in regards to fighting, you default to the level of your training. And if your training doesn't include defense against spinning elbows, you'll be open to being hit by that strike. However, that alone isn't enough to explain the effectiveness of the spinning back elbow, since some gyms with harder sparring cultures do allow you to throw those strikes. So to show why exactly the spinning back elbow is taking over MMA, I first need to explain the broad metagame for modern mixed martial arts. If you watch a lot of MMA, you would know that in the modern era of mixed martial arts, the most effective tactics all revolve around how a fighter uses the fence. The fence can be used for securing takedowns and getting up from takedowns. Clinching opponents up against the fence is one of the most effective and frustrating stalling tactics in the sport. And when it comes to striking, pressuring your opponent and cutting off the cage is the number one way to secure a KO. A great example of a fighter doing this effectively is Alex Pereira in his first MMA fight against Israel Adesanya, where Alex tagged Adesanya with an uppercut, and as soon as Adesanya tried to circle out to the left, Pereira caught him with a lunging left hook, which led to a TKO finish. Another example of this working at the highest level in MMA is Topuria's win over Volkanovski, where Topuria backed Volk up to the fence with a right overhand, and then as soon as Volk tried to circle out, he timed the right hook. The reason why so many KOs take place along the fence is because the fence prevents a fighter from lessening the impact of a blow by leaning back. Also, since it hinders vertical movement, the opponent must move laterally, giving the attacking fighter the opportunity to land a power shot as their target tries to distance themselves from the fence. Pressuring your opponent up to the fence so that you can land power strikes is so important that coaches like Eric Nixick of Extreme Couture have made entire instructionals just about this topic. Now, the question is, how do you counter an aggressive opponent who's pressuring you up to the fence? In boxing, the most common counterattack you see thrown is the lead hook. This is because the lead hook has you transferring the weight in your stance from the lead leg to your rear leg, meaning you will get more power in the shot when leaning backwards. Also, in closed stance matchups, so orthodox versus orthodox or southpaw versus southpaw, the lead hook can loop around your opponent's rear hand and catch them if they are reckless while throwing. However, when the fence is in the way, throwing the lead hook as a counter becomes much more dangerous, as you can't lean back as much, if at all. And the lead hook also requires you to plant your feet when throwing to get power behind the shot, making you a stationary target. The best example that demonstrates this is Adesanya's fight against Sean Strickland. In the first round, Strickland backs Adesanya back to the fence. Adesanya loads up a lead hook, but Strickland throws a straight right down the pipe. Since straight punches beat looping punches, Strickland's punch connects first. And since Adesanya's back is to the fence, he can't lean back to diminish the power of the shot, leading to him getting dropped by Strickland, a fighter who is notorious for being pillow-fisted. So if the lead hook doesn't work as a counter, what does? And that's where the spinning back elbow comes in. If you watch the KO that Diego Lopes got against John Silva, Silva was pressuring Lopes up to the fence with his right hand by his waist. If Lopes had just thrown the lead hook here, Silva could have beat him to the punch with a straight right hand. But what Lopes does is step out, which gets him off the center line, and throws the spinning back elbow. This catches Silva, drops him, and leads to the finish. The same applies to the KO that Laurel Murphy got against Aaron Pico. Pico shifts to the right to get an angle on Murphy, but Murphy steps out, spins, and catches Pico, putting him out cold. And finally, Sergio Pettis got a similar KO against Magomed Magomedov, albeit this one was in the open stance matchup, so Southpaw versus Orthodox. Magomedov was pressuring Pettis up to the fence, leaving Pettis no room to throw back. As Magomedov goes for a flying knee, Pettis tries to keep him away with a sidekick. That misses, but Pettis then plants that leg out to the side to create space, evading Magomedov's follow-up right hand, and then loads up the elbow. In all of these spinning back elbow KOs, the spinning elbow comes from the same side as the fighter's lead hook. However, unlike the lead hook, which requires you to plant your stance and transfer weight from your lead leg to your rear leg to generate power, since the spinning elbow lets a fighter step out at an angle to land the attack, they can get their head off the center line and circle out in a safer direction. So basically, what I'm getting at here is that the spinning back elbow is an alternative to the lead hook that you can throw as a counter against opponents who are pressuring you up against the fence. Now, of course, this doesn't apply to all spinning back elbow KOs. Pratis' KO against Jafnil was out in the open, and Yuri's KO against Reyes had Reyes backed up against the fence. However, I still wanted to highlight that one particular trend that we are seeing, as the spinning back elbow really is a great counter to one of the most common strategies of the modern MMA metagame. When thinking of ways to counter the spinning back elbow, I think what fighters need to do is quite clear. Threaten to shoot and take the back. If a fighter is going to spin, that is the perfect time to shoot in and secure a takedown, or, even better, back control. The best example of this is Valentina Shevchenko throwing a spinning kick, having her back taken by Alexa Grasso, and then subbed. Being recklessly aggressive with strikes when pressuring their opponent up to the cage is what got Silva, Pico, and Magomedov caught. A more methodical approach that included threatening the back take would have resulted in less risk. Albeit, in Silva and Pico's cases, they were at a jiu-jitsu disadvantage against their opponents, but in that case I just have to say, tough luck, right? It's MMA. But anyways, in conclusion, that's my now nearly 14-minute take on a single technique, and why it's seemingly taking over MMA nowadays. I know it's different from the other stuff I put out typically, but I really wanted to discuss this topic in particular because nobody else had really commented on why this strike in particular has become so effective recently. Anyways, like, share, hype, and sub. Goodbye.